This video is brought to you by the Native Oak and has been sponsored by War Thunder. If you're familiar with my work at all, then you know that I am a massive proponent of historical reenactment and especially military reenactment. I believe that it's an extraordinary tool for public education and for the support of historic sites. I also believe that through reenactment's inherent reliance on the practical application of material culture, it can not only help us to teach history, but to better understand it as well. But reenactment isn't without its problems. In fact, there are an awful lot of them, the likes of which I could rant about for hours, which doesn't surprise any of you, I'm sure. Chief among those problems is when reenactors will take their experiences engaging in the hobby and assume that those experiences are a closer approximation to historical reality than they really are. In the end, reenactment is only one very specific approach to historical study. Regardless of how authentic one's costuming is, and regardless of how well-versed they are in the history, how into the character you can get, it's always going to be limited. It's never going to be a one-to-one. Now, I know that this may shock some of you, but in the name of pursuing better history, I need to peel back a little curtain here. You see this? That was fake. So was this. And that. In fact, not only did I not actually die on that day, I was never even shot. I've literally never been shot my entire life. Nor have I been stabbed, beaten. The worst I've ever gotten was a few little burns and a nasty scrape on a bit of flint. But other than that, it was all an act. It was all just an elaborate ruse intended to fool you, the audience. And so on behalf of the entire reenactment community, I'd like to offer you all a formal apology for that, our deceit, for it's all deception, I'm afraid. Now I'd like to offer you a quick ad as well. War Thunder is a free-to-play vehicle combat game where you, oh yes you, can take command over 2,500 plus different tanks, aeroplanes, helicopters, and even ships from 10 major nations from the interwar years up to the present day, all of which you can customize with your own camouflages, historical markings, and fanciful decorations. And what do you do in these amazingly rendered, realistic-looking and sounding vehicles? Well, you'll engage in massive PvP battles, engaging enemy units with one of the most sophisticated vehicle damage models in gaming today. So you'll need to take careful aim at your opponent's engine systems and fuel tanks, or perhaps something more gruesome, you can aim for their crew with armor-piercing rounds. It all behaves just like the real-world counterparts, and you can explore the results of that realistic damage modeling with the game's X-ray view, which allows you to examine precisely how you took down the foe. With over 70 million players worldwide, the enjoyer of military history will never find a shortage of exciting matches and content to explore in this, the most comprehensive vehicle combat simulation game on the market. And you can join those players today on PC, PlayStation, or Xbox, all for free. And what's more is that when you do so using the link in the pinned comment or description down below, new and returning players who haven't played for 6 months will receive a massive bonus pack across all platforms, which grants multiple premium vehicles, an exclusive vehicle decorator, 100,000 silver lions, and 7 days of premium account time. But the bonus is only available for a limited time, so go and check it out today. Thank you to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to the topic. Okay though, silliness aside, I know it's obvious, but this really does speak to a very important limitation in military reenactment that I don't think gets enough attention. That when we go to an event, we're all doing so willingly, as part of a hobby where there's practically zero risk of death or serious injury for anyone involved. And that simple fact ultimately changes so much of every element of how the real historical events we're seeking to portray would have transpired. When individuals are under threat of being maimed by cannon shot or gutted by a bayonet, they will inherently behave in a very different manner than when they're not. Not very surprising to hear that, I know, but it's worth consideration. They're going to march differently. They're going to go through their exercise differently. They're going to speak with each other and comprehend their orders differently. Everything. Likewise, for when reenactors know that we're only at an event for the weekend, when the battle comes after a bit of morning drill and a lunch break, rather than months or even years of hard campaigning and privation. The knowledge we have that after our buddies go down in the shady field without any blood and guts and whatnot, that's a big benefit as well, well, we know they're just gonna stand back up at the end and walk away to their cars. Ultimately, these elements of the risk to life and limb are the most basic, core elements of the history of combat. Quite literally everything in this field of military history, on some level or another, revolves around the core fact that warfare is a science of organized killing. From the way in which units are formed, to the way that they're clothed, to the equipment that they're using, to say nothing of the psychological elements behind enlistment and recruiting practices, behind campaigning and battling, and of course how these individuals' lives are progressing after their service. All the time, I see people in reenactments behaving in ways that frankly don't make any level of sense, because there's no real sense of anxiety or pressure at these events. Through no fault of their own, it's impossible to recapture that, unless you're actually shooting at people, which obviously is less than desirable. But nobody is ever afraid of anything, obviously, and so no matter what, they're going to behave in a way that reflects that. Charges will succeed that historically never would have done. Volleys are either far more or far less effective than what they really would have been historically. Formations will behave in unrealistic ways, and individuals will behave in poorly understood approximations to historical combat, rather than what the sources tell us actually would have, or in fact did outright, happen. And all of this is inherently, to a greater or lesser extent, always on some level going to be the case, no matter how amazingly accurate the field is, or even how professional the reenactors themselves are, no matter how much into the acting of it all they get. And unfortunately, this becomes a problem when I see individuals taking these sorts of inherently flawed experiences, but then relating them to members of the public as if they were entirely historical, either because they believe it themselves or because they're trying to make the hobby and the show that we're putting on seem maybe more impressive than it might be. In fact, I'm sure that this is a sin that I've been guilty of as well, because, well, let's be honest, it's a really easy trap to fall into. It's a really difficult thing to ward against, and it's something that we always need to be continually working on, I think, striving to do better with, to not just assume that what we're experiencing is a one-to-one to history, because we are missing out on a lot of those elements, even if we may not immediately realize it. Military reenactment surrounds itself with material culture. The uniforms, the button counts, the way that men would march and what they would eat, and all the rest. But ultimately, there is a very definitive, very unavoidable, hard limit on how accurate it can ever become. And something tells me that reenactment isn't the only field with this limitation either. Now, I am not, in case you couldn't tell, a practitioner of historical European martial arts, or HEMA as it's called. But from what I know of it, it seeks to recreate armed and armored combat across various elements of European history, particular favorites being medieval through to the early modern era. But you know, if you just go and pick up a sword and shield and start whacking away at each other, whether you're complete amateurs or the best of professionals at it, I suspect that pretty immediately you're going to realize that you're moving and behaving in a different way than you would ever be doing so if you knew that, the moment that the sword lands a hit, you're not just raising your arm saying, oh, you got me, going to the back now, but you just actually get sliced. I suspect, again, I have no real experience with it, but I suspect that this means that blows are never quite landed at the full strength that they could have been. This is something very common, after all, when HEMA and reenactment cross over more fully. You get things like, medieval reenactment, Anglo-Saxon and Viking type stuff. I know that people spar in a mutually understood fashion, and yeah, they're going to pull their blows a bit, and they're only going to do certain, kinds of move sets, if you will, to ensure that everyone is safe. Even with their wearing the armor, while the armor is going to be completely historical, it might not meet modern safety standards, even against blunted steel. It might have an open face or an exposed eye. It's not modern-day fencing garb or modern-day, sparring garb. And so you need to have a mutually understood, like, okay, hey, I know I'm a Norman, you're a Saxon, but we'll all agree I won't go for the eyes on this one because it's not a good idea now, is it? I would also suspect that along those lines, certain forms, if you will, certain approaches are going to be far less likely to be attempted. For example, full force stabbing as opposed to slicey dicing, unless you're in a very secure environment with professionals, everyone's on the same page, and again, they're properly outfitted, properly armed with fencing type gear and sparring gear. But then as well, like in that situation, even if, people are quite literally fully going at it, well, in which case, again, you're dealing with professionals who know that they're properly armored. And, even at the worst possible case scenario, say something does go horribly wrong, well, then they still have the awareness that they're going to get treated with fully modern medical care. I wouldn't really, or rather, I really would be shocked if, all of that didn't mean that in HEMA, individuals are, on average, they're just inherently more likely to maybe go out on limbs that otherwise wouldn't necessarily be risked. They might be just a teensy bit, even just a smidgen more bold. They might be even a little bit more formal. They're able to, stick with forms and techniques and approaches a lot better than would someone who, again, knows that if they mess up a little bit, they're getting a dagger in the eye. You know what they say about like the best laid plans and all of that. To put it all very simply, you can imagine how two guys or a group of guys or whatever it is sparring in a gym, regardless of how, very professional they are and how, in tune with the history and committed to realistic portrayals and everything, regardless of all that, they're only ever going to be able to get so close to the reality of, two spearmen in a muddy field in France surrounded by corpses. Even if they're just attempting to portray a duel, like a non, a duel not to the death, like a sportsman type thing, back in the day, which did happen a fair amount, I'm pretty sure. Well, I should still think then that the expectation of pain and how much to expect, whether it's going to be there. And yes, in fact, still the risk to life, even if it's not like a guaranteed death, if you're sparring with steel, it's still a possibility. Well, the fact that the modern guys are going to know that they're safer and that they've taken all the precautions and everything, well, that's going to play a pretty major role that I would think would otherwise be absent from that hobby. I'm sure it still hurts if you get, whaled with a sword, but, if you know for a fact that you're going to be okay, as opposed to two guys fencing with just like regular clothes because, back in the day they were crazy, I guess, or, they didn't have quite the same health and safety standards, well, again, that's going to play a role. And now all that being said, if there is anyone out there who practices HEMA or, airsoft or fencing, really any kind of physical simulated combat,
I would love to hear your thoughts on these limitations. Heck, even military training that, is like, drill in boot camp and whatnot, and then actual deployment in the field. How all of these things sort of play into one another. I think there are a lot of perspectives that are really important to hear from on this issue and be really interesting, but which I cannot quite provide as merely a reenactor and an historian. So yes, I would love to hear your thoughts on all these limitations and how they may or may not impact your hobby and its potential value as far as historical education is concerned.
But on that note, well, this does all sound rather pessimistic, I know. Does this mean that reenactment and HEMA and all the rest don't have anything to offer us in terms of historical knowledge? Is it all just playing a game? Well, no, that is not what I'm saying. Rather, I'm saying that we as practitioners of these hobbies need to have an understanding of those limitations, and we need to place these hobbies within their appropriate historical context. We need to understand that they are not and never will be perfect one-to-ones of historical reality. Rather, HEMA and reenactment are among the many different directed approaches that allow us to gain a better understanding of very specific elements of history, and of military history in this case. They are tiny windows through which we might get a better, but by no means total, understanding of history as a whole. And then, how do we gain further windows into the past? How do we contextualize and ground these hobbies and better differentiate between their real educational value and the so-called reenactorisms? Well, it's through research, primary research especially, through reading the memoirs and the journals of those individuals who experienced the things for real that we're seeking to understand. It's through examining the things that they wore directly. It's through examining the equipment that they really used, which we're trying to recreate. It's by looking at the artwork and the sketches that they used to portray that which we are seeking to portray as they themselves saw it directly. What is HEMA without the original manuscripts and those fighting treatises? What is Napoleonic reenactment without the soldiers' memoirs and the manual exercise? Well, at the end of the day, it's little more than guesswork. But when we're armed with those sources, the words, the wisdom, and as well, yes, the material culture of those who came before and the ones we're seeking to better understand, well, not only can we better understand the context behind everything that we're doing, but we can also understand why it's being done as it is to begin with and what makes it so important. Research, research, research. That really is the name of the game with any of these hobbies. Even like historical wargaming with the miniatures and whatnot. Yeah, some of them could have systems where they try to emulate things like, morale checks and the like, but those are formalized mathematical systems for what is ultimately a very, shall we say, ethereal concept of morale and psychology and the rest. So all of these things, if you want to have a proper understanding of what they all mean and better understand the value which they can definitely provide us, well, you have to back it up. It has to be with research.
So if you're interested in these hobbies, if you're looking to get involved with them, well, you do not have to start out as an expert. Nobody ever does. And you shouldn't let that distract you from, getting stuck into it, having an amazing time, meeting some great friends, and having great experiences. These hobbies are an amazing way, I think, to begin one's education. When I first joined up with the Revolutionary War group, way back when, I knew practically nothing about the American War of Independence, but it sort of opened up a new world to me in that way. Same thing with, a lot of different time periods that I've reenacted before. But I think that still it's important that you have in mind that you understand the limitations of these hobbies, and when you address those limitations, that you reinforce them. the most important thing, or at least a very, very important thing, is that you try your best, though like I said, it can be really difficult at times until you learn better. Try your best to not assume that your experiences at that event would necessarily be a one-to-one to history. If you're wearing a bit of kit and it feels a certain way, don't just assume that that's how it felt back in the day. When you're blazing away in a firing line, don't assume that that's a one-to-one. If you're in there, with a sword and board, don't make those assumptions. And most certainly, do not relate those assumptions to members of the public, because odds are they'll take what you say as fact. They shouldn't, but a lot of times I think the public who aren't as informed about history at all, really, they're going to look at the guy in the full outfit and they're going to assume that he's 100% on everything that they're saying, And on that same note, incidentally, just because a reenactor says it, don't just take their word for it. Rather, it's important that you use your experiences reenacting as a foundation to then continue your learning. Again, like a reenactor says something to you, don't just believe it. Ask where you can find out more. Ask where you can read more about what they're saying, and then verify the information for yourself. And that includes anything that's coming from me, by the by. I like to think that I do a good job, but nobody is perfect, least of all a YouTuber. So, trust, but verify. As I always like to put it, getting a little rambly here, but as I always like to put it, recreated experiences need to represent the beginning of your educational journey, not the end. And when you look at it in that way, I think that you're going to find that your reading of primary sources and of secondary scholarship, your examination of paintings and of photographs and the like, well, all of it is going to feed into everything else. And it creates that just wonderfully, incredibly immersive and fulfilling experience that is meaningful research. History is an amazing thing, but it's also complicated. It's a really complicated subject, and its study is a lifelong pursuit. So overall, really just never lose sight of that pursuit. Never get too comfortable in what you know, and make as few assumptions as possible. Speaking of amazing things, this video's sponsor, War Thunder, is also an amazing thing. Remember, you can check them out with the link below to play today for free on PC, PlayStation, or Xbox, while new players, or those returning after a 6-month absence, will get a massive bonus pack, including premium vehicles and 7 days of premium account time. Thank you all for watching, most particularly, of course, to those ever-beneficent supporting classes who support my work on Patreon. In the end, it's because of their generosity that I'm able to actually carry out this work. And if you're interested in learning more about my work, well, you can visit my website, nativeoak.org, where you'll find my reading recommendations, including, of course, my new book, Something Like Philosophy, as soon as it's released, a free PDF library of primary sources. You can get started on that research for yourself. And, of course, you can learn more about our charitable efforts there as well. And until the next time, my dear viewer, I am, and I shall remain, your most humble and obedient of servants.